I am exactly where I need to be in this moment. I am in complete harmony with those around me who share this moment with me. I contribute only truth and love to those around me. I am being used as a beacon of light to transmit God's divine purpose to others. I will bring peace to this moment. Now let there be truth, love, light, and peace. When one meanders about her tedious life in oblivion, she is likened to being asleep. Yet, there are moments in such a life that are requisite in her awakening. These moments are also known as visions, and if one can maintain vigilance during these moments, one may begin to unravel the tightly woven thread of her life's purpose. And of course, as with anything in life, when one first awakens to a new beginning, she must strengthen her muscles of awareness. This gets easier with time, and when one strengthens a certain muscle, it is nearly impossible for the other muscles to be neglected.
Welcome to Vision Class.
The web-based open classroom that helps its students interconnect to achieve their visions and find their life's greater purpose. Students can join Vision Class by simply logging onto YouTube and subscribing to the Vision Class channel. For a duration of 12 weeks, Vision Class will air a 1-hour lecture every Friday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, beginning Friday, June 7th, 2013.
So to stay abreast of what's going on in class and to always be aware, just remember you just want to go to our Facebook or Google Plus pages and you want to download the syllabus. Or you can download the syllabus directly by clicking on the link below. We have had some technical difficulties with downloading the syllabus, especially from Android phones. But in which case, if you're having any difficulties, never hesitate to email me at sugarfreemail@rocketmail.com, where I will answer questions and I will also be available to submit to you the syllabus if you are having issues with downloading it.
There are 6 class texts you will need for Vision Class. Creative Visualization by Shakti Gawain, Write It Down, Make It Happen by Henriette Ann Clouser, The Isaiah Effect by Greg Braden, or A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, The Spontaneous Healing of Belief by Greg Braden, and The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
The whole purpose of Vision Class is to interconnect, is to share, is to gain everyone's insight and testimonials such that your own vision is fueled. We want you not only to find your visions in life, but we want to use those visions as points on a map to help you figure out your life purpose, your life path.
Vision Class is updated constantly with information and changes that are vital to each student's success, so it is important that students remain vigilant of these updates on their own. By accessing our Facebook and Google Plus sites, students can find everything from the course syllabus to free downloadable texts by the mere click of a button. To access all Vision Class links for Facebook, simply click on the Notes section. To access all Vision Class links for Google Plus, simply click on the About tab at the top of the page and scroll down to the Links section. Students can also access the Vision Class calendar from one of the aforementioned sections, which allows you a quick glance of all dates, times, and assignments for Vision Class.
For your daily assignments, you'll need 3 notebooks to get started.
A notebook of any size to be utilized as a journal, labeled as the Legacy Book. A small notebook that is portable to carry with you at all times, labeled as the Intention Book. And a medium to large size notebook to help you take notes and complete class assignments labeled as the Vision Book. You will also need a presentation board of any kind, which you will update throughout class with inspirations and visions you hope to achieve in your life, newly titled the Envision Board.
This class is not, I will say it a million times, if you've never heard me say it once, you're going to hear me say it now. This class is not about what you're able to accomplish. Okay, it is about what you do with your time. So it's not just, hey, I'm able to cover all the text material, Shira, now what? Because you can read all these books all day long and never become aware of your reality. No, this class is about how you connect to yourself, how you connect to your creator. How do you do that? By what you put into the class. This is about how to interconnect with your fellow students and find a way that works for you, such that this becomes a habit. And once this way of life becomes a habit for you, you will notice how easy it is to incorporate the elements of this class into your life.
Today in Vision Class, we discuss all the tools for activating our visions through reading and recovering a sense of possibility. We will discuss the first 5 chapters from A New Earth. Today's reading comes from The Artist's Way, Week 5, and to begin reading either A New Earth or The Isaiah Effect. Today's assignment is to continue working on morning pages, your artist date, and jotting down dreams and visions in your vision book, continue printing photos and working on your Envision board, focus on readings, and posting any insight gleaned from readings on Facebook or Google+.
Welcome to week 5 of Vision Class, which is now late. 2 of the resources for today that you absolutely need to probably eventually holler at is my video, The Phases of Rebirth, which is going to be covered in so many ways today. You're going to see so much about the phases of rebirth in this lecture. And then, of course, Mastery of Love by Don Miguel Ruiz, who is one of the authors that we will partake in on week 9 and 10. Brought up in office hours was this concept of how do you know that you're on your right path? What is the right path? How do you know that you're on it? That type of a question. And that question often gets combined with how do I know my life's purpose? And that often is the reason that you're here in Vision Class probably, or you're here to manifest a vision, one or the other. So how do you know you're on the path? Well, primarily, you are always on the path. Now, that sounds paradoxical because you're just like, why would I already be on the path if I'm coming here to discover? Exactly. You're coming to this class for awareness. You will find that today awareness is everything. You will find out. You will also realize that because you're becoming aware, you recognize where you are on your path, which just helps you align to it just a little bit quicker. Well, what's quicker, Shira, if time is fake? Because I say a lot of things in this class that sound very paradoxical, very contradictory, because it's confusing to a lot of folk. So I should break it down for you. When you have the awareness that you're on your path, you're not necessarily aligning with your path. We say that because we are trying to make it understandable for human ears. And I know that sounds strange, but you see, to an animal, right, who doesn't have this complex thought process that we have as human beings, to a different type of animal, there is no non-path. They're just on it until they get run over by a car or whatever, euthanized. So that's not funny, but I mean, well, I mean, it's life. That's the point. The point is that it's life, and it just is. To the trees that get demolished in order for us to have paper, and all of the different environmental beings who are not human beings have no thought. They have only being. You will learn that today. So to know that you're on your path is to simply align with what already is, which gives you a sense of power, which then you utilize to attract things towards you, but really you're not even attracting anything towards you. You are stepping where these things happen in a way that is what is considered peaceful. When you align with your path, again, I'm making this in very human terms, but aligning with one's path simply means being, connecting to that. And once you connect, what starts happening is everything that you want is in alignment with what is wanted for you and what is designed for you to feel peaceful. So when you go and you reach for that thing that gives you peace and joy, it's right there. Just so happens to be there at that moment. We call it synchronicity. Well, no, it's not synchronicity. It's a reminder that you are always there, because there's only always now. The female authors who are no longer in the picture except for Julia Cameron, and now we are going on to the male authors. What I've ascertained is that men have more of a conceptual grasp on things, and women have more of an intuitive grasp on things. So the women tend to write in an artistic fashion. Here's an exercise. Go jogging for 3 minutes in the rain, and then write it down in your morning pages. That's the type of books that we were reading. Now we're about to read, the reason that you are this and this is because you're a whore. Ah! You know, we're going to be like, oh my God, really? It's like that. Okay. But the men are conceptual. The point is, men are more outward, women are more inward. That's why they're intuitive. That's why men are more conceptual. So I believe that the males here can break it on down because that's what they're used to doing. And I don't even mean that to be funny, but it just so happens that the last 3 books, all males, are conceptual. Why are we introducing concepts now as opposed to prior? We are not introducing concepts in the beginning because concepts are difficult to understand for people. I'm sorry, it just is. Doing the work, which is what we talked about that triangle. Doing the work is a lot more easy for people than to actually understand why they're doing the work. Because I've been explaining morning pages for the last 5 lectures. So that being said, it's not so easy conceptually. People still don't get it. People still do not write in their morning pages. People still do not do artist date. It is now a way of life for me that I do these things. It is a way of life, period. Like after the class is said and done, I will still do morning pages. Why? Because conceptually I understand why these things work. And if I did not, I would not, which I have not in the past. So we want to start getting conceptual, which means this information is very difficult to ascertain. So what you must do is the reading. So speaking of reading, we're talking about reading this week and what's important about reading. Reading is activating your vision with knowledge. Well, why is reading essential? Reading is essential because that is how we, after spreading the information, that is how we interpret the information, right? So if you're writing a hieroglyph, your intention is to put that information out there. If you're writing Okay, you are spreading the knowledge, you're putting the knowledge out there. And if you're reading, you're picking up the information, right? So there's all this abundance of information, right, out in the world, and we need to know about it. Why? Because the more you know, the more you open your mind, and you will find out today that the more you open your mind, the less you are what? Resistant. And as just a look forward, we're going to talk about gratitude next week. Well, why is gratitude important? We'll find out next week, week 6. We're also going to just touch on Julia Cameron's week 5, recovering a sense of possibility, as to why we place limitations on our creator's ability to manifest for us what we want. Why? We'll just talk about that briefly. So we're checking in and we're talking about morning pages. Now, I've been trying to check in. I've had a little bit of an incident this week, but I will cover that later when it becomes necessary. And we've been all writing in our morning pages, right, class? So because we've been writing in our morning pages every day, and you have to really report these findings on Facebook. Don't ever forget, the more that you report, the more involved you are, the more you will experience the benefits of this class. Trust me on that one. So make sure you are checking in. That being said, we have a young lady named Brittany who wrote a testimonial on our page. She was checking in and she was talking about morning pages and an experience, a divine experience that she had writing. And the reason I want you to see this is exactly the type of experience that if you are writing the morning pages as they are intended to do, you will have.
Last week, I had an attack. Not a physical attack, but let's just say I was going out of God's will, and God let me know He was not happy with my actions. In result to my actions, I had a dream that night that scared the crap out of me. I know dreams are not always true and can be misleading because they never symbolize the true meaning that they convey. Through the morning pages and writing to a solution, God told me what the dream meant. When I awoke from my nightmare, aka dream, I went straight to writing the morning pages. Now, before I go on, let me say I've experienced what you call God's writing in the past on numerous occasions where you don't think, you just write. But when I tell you I experienced that to the umpteenth power, you wouldn't believe me. My hand looked as if it were being controlled by another force. Words were coming onto the paper before I could even process them. I couldn't process them. All I could think about was to look at my hand as it went. As I wrote, I watched in amazement. It sounds silly. If I didn't believe in God, that was enough to make anyone believe. Let us take the time to thank Brittany for her testimony and to affirm the following. Brittany is attracting more divine morning page experiences for both herself and the rest of Vision class. Ashe.
So I want to just go ahead and thank you, Brittany, for sharing that with us. And everybody, I want you to know that is how morning pages should feel. Because we're all thinking about morning pages in terms of being journals and entries, and I don't want to talk about my crappy life. And you really aren't. But you do have to complain first. And if you are complaining, well, we'll talk about that a little bit later today when we talk about a new earth. So that being said, make absolutely sure that you are complaining until you have that type of experience that Brittany had, because that is the experience that I now experience 9 times out of 10 when doing the morning pages. 9 times out of 10. That level of openness, because you are not writing at that point. The level of openness that you are now channeling becomes a practice that you are now doing every day. You're practicing openness. And as you practice openness, there only becomes more openness throughout other areas of your life. You sit here and, you think nothing is happening as it should, and then you turn around and then you experience synchronicity. Well, why did that happen? Why did I experience synchronicity all of a sudden? Because you are writing in the pages and you are becoming open. You are becoming less resistant. Because trust me, it is so difficult to take a pen out and write 3 pages, apparently. So here is a really good idea. Tay Queen came up with something I absolutely adore, my eyeball. I absolutely adore as an idea, and some of you are catching on. The point of morning pages is that you wake up looking a little something like this when you start writing.
Okay, this is when you want to do your morning pages. First wake up. You see this here? All of that? God forgive me for waking up and showing you this, but this is when you do the pages, alright? Alright.
So now that you saw my morning breath in the that is the state of discombobulation you want to be in when you do the morning pages. Instead of my doing the morning pages right there, I made a video for you guys. So that being said, that is where you want to be mentally when you start writing. Very confused. You still have stuff in your eyes. Like you can't even, I barely could look at the page sometime when I'm like writing. Like, am I writing on these lines? And here's a suggestion that Tay Queen came up with. Tay Queen decided that in order for you to be in that state, sometimes it's just really hard for us mentally to wake up at 5 a.m. Nobody wants to wake up early before work to write. So what if you woke up in the middle of the night, did it, and went back to bed? That was a great idea. I mean, hey, look, it's not morning pages per se in the sense that you do it contiguously with the rest of your day. But are you writing in that state of non-consciousness? Absolutely. So I personally, knowing what the morning pages should feel like, I know that that couldn't be harmful, right? And it could set your entire day up, of course, for how it's going to go. Of course, if you can wake up early and you can make it contiguous with the rest of your day, by all means, I would agree with that. But if some of you just can't do that, try that suggestion. I think it's a great idea. Possibility, recovering a sense of possibility. Possibility is the idea that there are no limitations. Limitations are also known as resistance. What are limitations? Of course, we've talked about this a multitude of times. We have all grown up with this concept in our mind that we are not enough and that what we do will never be enough. So we place limits on things, right? We don't think that if we do A, B is going to happen. We just don't believe in it, right? And we have a creator who has an unlimited supply of what we need. Well, Shira, how do you know that? I mean, Julia Cameron talks about it, but how do you know that? How I know that is because how could God, God, okay, let's personify God for a second because that makes sense. But anyways, we're going to, for the all intents and purposes, let's personify God real fast. And God is passing out everyone's blessings for their lifetime. I'm going to give Beyonce $400 million. Looks and a great body. Done. I'm going to give that poor person over there nothing and you're going to get raped when you are 15 years old. Go on. I mean, is God sitting there doling out punishments and blessings? Are we perceiving them different? Absolutely. Right? Because of course perception says that that's the worst experience, but who knows? That might be the most humbling experience. That might be the experience that take that person and make them Oprah Winfrey. I mean, we don't know, right? But what's the point? The point is, since I don't believe God is sitting there judging predeterminately, and because I know where I have risen from, I know that we all have this capability. So we place limitations on our creator who gives an unlimited supply of things out. They're just things, they're transient, which we will learn again today, later on when we talk about a new earth. So if God is not unequally dividing out the gifts and the blessings, where do we fall in that place? We have to pick ourselves up to believe that we are capable of manifesting those dreams, visions, and blessings. So that is where you are now. That is what you have to begin to release, is your sense of limitations. Of course, there are a whole slew of exercises that I list at the end of this lecture that you can try so that you can learn to take the limitations off of yourself. And I think that it's also intriguing that Julia Cameron brings up this really interesting fact. She said the same God that developed the subatomic structure can't fulfill our dreams. I know that's right. I know that's right. Because we're up here like, look, honey, we all want money and we all want power and we all want, stability. Let's talk about our state of mind. How many people want that? I'd like that, please. That I would like. Out of everything that I could have, can I have a peace of mind, my right mind? Absolutely, I want it. I absolutely want my mind. Trust me, because that's the hardest place to live in. And I'm telling you something, you can have all the riches in the world. If your mind is gone, honey, done. You're done on this earth. So that being said, why do we not believe it? Why are we so willing to believe in the marvels of the universe that God did create, that we know, right? That we've seen. We've seen the subatomic structure. We've seen the DNA helix, double helix. We've seen the ways that we can alter. I mean, we've seen what we humans can do. What do you think God can do? I'm sorry, I just have to point that out, baby, because we always love to doubt. Don't we love to doubt? Let's try to remember. Right, okay. So let's remember that when you're thinking of your visions, get invigorated. Like, why would it not happen for you? Well, I just don't see it happening. That's because, as Julia Cameron said, we place far too much of our power in human hands. But what about God? That's deep. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about with Julia Cameron, she talks about this river, and you want to liken life to a river. And the analogy that she gave was to go with the flow, saying yes to everything. I'm going to give an even deeper analogy because I came up with this while I was shopping for that mug, in fact. So I'm going to tell you about this analogy, and I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. Okay, so life is a river, right? Well, let's not even think of life as life. Let's just think of you as being life, a manifestation of life, and you are the water of a river. Now, during your flow, right, you always pass. The water doesn't necessarily get recycled. I mean, it does get recycled. The water does get recycled, but for the intents and purposes, you are a stream, right? Stream of consciousness. We talked about that. You're a stream, right? And sometimes your tide is more robust, and then sometimes your flow is more trickling, right? And depending on how many rocks are in that stream or how narrow that path may be through which the water can flow, you may have some obstacles, right? But do you continue to flow past the obstacles, or do you allow a pebble lodged in your path to stop you? Well, maybe sometimes the path is narrower, so a pebble takes up more space, or perhaps the path is wider and you're just creating a dam out of a pebble. But the idea is to continue flowing past the pebble so that the pebble becomes dislodged and flows with you as well. That's the idea. Or if it wants to be stubborn, then it becomes a part of the path that you flow past. But we can think of this as your life's path. We could think of this also as you. So you can think of this analogy and start to really understand that life for you should be likened to that stream. I mean, what type of stream have you seen that stops for a pebble? I mean, unless the flow is light and the stream is narrow. But if it's not, why would a big river raging stop for a pebble? You would think that the river is crazy, right? Flowering of Human Consciousness. Okay, so this book, we're going to break it on down, but you know what? There's not enough words that I could use to break this book down. So you want to read it, make sure. All right, so the flowering of human consciousness. First and foremost, I don't know if you guys noticed that one of the symbols of vision class, which I always put the quotes on, in its proper color and aesthetic, is the lotus flower. It's no coincidence that, of course, Eckhart Tolle speaks about a flowering of human consciousness. What is a flower? A flower is just a representation that is often utilized in most religions, most spiritual traditions, as a bearer of life. Why? Because a flower just is. A flower, how many times is mentioned in the Bible? Amen. We talk about why do you worry if God takes care of the flowers and the birds? And then we hear, Jesus talking about contemplating the flower, right? And then you have the Buddha, right? Talking about flower. I mean, flower. What's up with the flower? The flower is the representation. So Eckhart Tolle talks about naming. This is deep. I love it. I love it because he's so articulate, because I couldn't even say it. Like I said, the men do this, right? This is their job. So he talks about flowers and naming a flower. And he said, sometimes you mistake what you know as the title of something to be what it is. And that is the whole conundrum, the entire conundrum that we experience in the physical world. Period. So what we do as human beings is we say, this is a hair scarf, right? Without just looking at it for what it is, without feeling its energy. Now, people are going to say, that's insane, Shira. A scarf has no energy. Absolutely, right? It has energy. The point is, sure, a scarf does not necessarily represent the energy of a life form, which is why we talk about a flower. So the idea that when you see something and you name it, it's your way of communicating. We'll talk about this with Tay Queen a little bit later. But words are used as labels, meaning words take on their meaning because we assign something to it. It's not because it's what it is. Right? Because for all intents and purposes, if you go to the dictionary and you ask the dictionary what red means, there's no way to describe the color red other than a wavelength. There's no way of doing it. And in fact, the only way to describe an object is by the function that the object fulfills, but it does not describe the object. Whenever we see something, we often forget that there is an insurmountable amount of depth to an object beyond what we see it as. But we are so used, because our minds are so quick. Sorry, I was running up and down the stairs. Because our minds are so quick with our thoughts, instead of taking the full time to slow our thoughts down and say, that is a tree has all of this depth. When I stop to look at and observe the tree, I could know nothing about the tree except that I am unified with it, and that's it. Our thoughts can't do that. Our thoughts quickly say, there's a tree, I know what that is, right? There's a tree, I see it every day. And so what happens is we strip back the teachable moment, the knowledge of that one object that has energy. So I know that sounds very, very nebulous and very psychedelic. But the point is, we can translate that to human beings, right? We look at a human being and we think to ourselves, we know that person, right? Because they're Muslim, because they're Christian, because they're black, because they're Jewish, because they're white. We just look at a person and we make a judgment, right? Not a discernment like we will talk about in week 9. Not a discernment, we make a judgment because we think we know what we're looking at because we've seen others like it. And instead of our mind taking the time to see the sameness of it, like I said with the tree, we could see nothing but how we are unified. We do not sit there and look at people or anything else for that matter as how it is connected with us. We talked about the interconnectedness before. Where did we talk about the interconnectedness? We've talked about interconnectedness before, but now we're really getting into the fact that we are all expressions of one creator. We are all expressions of. Everything put together is the creator, like I talked about the piece of paper analogy. Why is it that we cannot just look at something and contemplate it and understand it as an essential component of us? Well, we'll talk about that later, the ego. So the flowering of human consciousness, much like a flower, is this emergence of people's awareness. which is what we are contributing to in this class. We're contributing to the greater awareness of the planet. And what does the awareness of the planet mean? The awareness means that, you see, there's what's called a critical threshold. The critical threshold means there's a certain number at which the drops in the bucket finally become enough to knock the bucket over, right? So there have been collectively all of these drops happening, and it didn't happen during slavery, and it didn't happen during the Enlightenment period in Europe, and it didn't happen, in South America recently where, there was this huge overtaking of imperialism and colonialism. It didn't happen in all these places during all these times in history. It just didn't happen. Now is the time. That is what we will talk about with Isaiah effect, but now is the time, right? Now is the time on a universal scale, and now is the time on a microbiological scale. So that is what we're talking about. Now is the time, and that's why vision class is important, because it's a community where people can bring this consciousness forward so that we can manifest. And the more that we manifest, the more that we believe, the more that we spread the message, the more that it does get out, the more that people wake up. And we're trying to wake up. So whether or not, as I said earlier, whether or not you knew it, you're already in it because you've heard it. It's come into your consciousness already. And whether you choose to gloss it over, not listen to it, or what have you, you've actually verbally heard me say it. So it's very different than having all the messages around you. Having a verbalization of what I'm saying will only lead you back to it. Okay, so just so you know that for the ego and the pain body, I do have 2 worksheets that are going to be available to you online per usual in my Google Drive section. And we want you to really, if you're having trouble understanding about the ego, these are consolidated worksheets where I take all of the concepts that he talks about with regards to the ego and I put it together because there's so much to this ego. It's just a really nice way of looking at a one page and really referencing it to understand what he's saying throughout the entire book about this ego and this pain body, which does get very confusing. So speaking of knowing what a word is, we talk about etymology. Etymology is the history of the derivation of a word, right? So if I have a word that is no, well, how did that word no mean what it means, right? So we have to learn the history of it. Why does no mean what it means in English and it also means the same thing in Spanish? Why does niet in German mean the same thing that no means in English? What does that mean? Why is that N sound there, right? Why is it very similar? Because there is a very universal etymology that goes behind it, goes deep. And we will have to talk about it next week with Tay Queen. But this etymology goes extremely deep because nothing is a mistake on this earth, down to the very language we speak. So words, they cast a spell on you. This is something that we will talk about again when we go into the 4 agreements, but it's just something that I want you to be aware of, that words cast spells, right? Because you hear the word, you interpret it as your thought, and then it becomes what you mistake yourself to be. But if you can separate yourself from the identification with these things, making them who you are, you separate yourself. And by separating yourself, if you can separate yourself from the identification of your thoughts with these words, right? I believe that I am this, right? We just talked about how we attach a label to something and we think we know what it is. We don't know what a tree is. A tree has leaves. Oh, really? That's a great answer. Okay, a tree is beyond leaves, all right? I mean, there's the amount of depth in a tree. What could a tree teach you about your life? What could a tree teach you about your life? Ask that question. If every being that God has brought on this earth has the right to be here, what makes you think the tree don't have just as much right to be here as you? Can the tree be sacrificed for your sake? Absolutely, you do have dominion. However, to look at a tree and say it's just there for paper is to undermine the brilliance and the intellect of God. So we have to make sure that we look at words very carefully. I try to examine what I do with very much intention. So if I say a word that does not serve me, or if I know a deeper meaning of the word, I will stop using the word because I'm now conscious of what it means. And I now have put a separateness between myself and my identification with what I think the word means. And now I've given the word its true meaning. Okay, so when we speak about the ego, we are speaking about a mechanism, a conceptual mechanism, not an actual or physical mechanism. What do you mean? What I mean is, as I said earlier, we are human beings, okay? So we interpret information on a physical level. We often need to see physical evidence of things. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just how we interpret information. And the reason that we do that is because we have been trained in the physical level, right? We're not trained to believe in our Creator's abilities to manifest what we'd like. We are more often taught in how we can rely on other human beings to bring us to this sort of salvation or this sort of rebirth that we're going through. If there is even a rebirth, there may not even be one in the physical realm. So, right, and we're taught that we do what? We grow up, we live, we die. That's it. That's our thought process in terms of how the universe works, when there are actually underpinnings much deeper that we can tap into. So in order to explain this, Eckhart Tolle personifies this concept, okay? Makes a concept into a person or a thing, and that thing is called the ego. The ego being the unawakened you, right? The you that is not fully aware of itself. The ego is not even fully aware of itself, right? But Eckhart Tolle had to break this concept down in terms of this personified thing, this personified concept, the ego, because again, in our physical minds, it's very difficult to grasp concepts. So we have to have something that feels and sounds like a human being for us to understand it. And that is why we talk about the ego. So the ego consists of content and structure. So content are the things that fill up the structure, which is in place to continue to perpetuate the cycle. So for the ego to continue its reign over you, it has to have a structure, okay? It has to have a setup, right? Just like in this house, there are things inside of the structure. There are things. What are those things? Those things are your thoughts. So the ego is typically about thought, right? And the content of the thought are the experiences that you gain as you grow up, right? Including your illusory self. These are all things that create the content of the ego. And of course, as I said, if you go reference my worksheets, you'll be able to see that in a format that's much easier to read than jumping around in this video and in that book just to figure out what the ego is. Your structure is the unconscious compulsion to identify yourself through association with an object, right? So your identity. So your identity is the structure, right? So the things that go in the structure, the things that go in the identity are the experiences, whereas the identity itself, this concept of you, is your structure of your ego, right? And the ego cannot survive without those two things. So we talked about etymology really briefly earlier. We talked about etymology being the history, the historic breakdown of words and how they've come to be. And one of the words that Eckhart Tolle often uses is called identity. Identity, which is meaning, the etymology of which means to make the same. So it's not necessarily the definition of the word identity. It is actually the etymology of the word identity. So what's the difference? Your definition is how we in this language understand the word. Etymology is the historic breakdown of the word, which is the more true esoteric meaning of the word. So if you think of the word identity, you have to now think of make the same as. And since your identity falls within the structure of the ego, your ego makes things the same as itself. So it seeks to identify, it seeks to make the same other things that are not of itself. For example, cars, fame, money, your kids, right? You identify with these things, you make them the same as you. Not in terms of, I think they're me, but in fact, you think of them as the same as what comprises your identity. Right? So because of your identification with form, all right, this is many different ways of saying this. So I'm just saying it in all of the different ways, paraphrasing it, that Eckhart Tolle uses. But when you identify with form, that is, when you identify or you make the form the same as you, then you have no awareness that you are not of the form, right? What is form? Form is physical life. So anything physical you identify with and you make it the same as you. You associate it with your identity, who you are, right? Okay, so that being said, you can associate this house as belonging to you. Remember we talked about me and mine? So this house belongs to me, it's mine. I make it the same as me. I think that it is part of me, right? So that way when I lose my house, then I think to myself, I've lost something that I have, this concept of ownership. Whereas you do not own your home, right? You own your home on paper, but you die without your home. You are born without your home. And even if you were born with a conceptual home, if Hurricane Katrina came by and you had no home, there would be no home. So it's still a concept. It's not a true ownership, because if it were an ownership, this would be an all or nothing thing. If you really and truly owned something, that means no one could take it from you. But if, for example, a dictator came through here and usurped your house, it would no longer be yours. Right? So there is no such thing as ownership. Ownership is a concept. It is not a truth. And the ego masks itself by tricking you into believing that these things are yours so that you have an identity, right? We're talking about identity. And why do you need an identity? Because when you have an identity, when you attach yourself to a concept and not to the real thing, then the ego can survive. The ego cannot coexist simultaneously with the knowledge of awakening, right? Cannot coexist. So if you're awakening and you're starting to understand that, you know what? I don't need this house. Or guess what? I don't need this body, because this body is a vehicle too. Don't get it twisted. We attach our identity to many things that are physical. But our physical bodies being one of them, right? That's our identity, right? I'm black, or I'm a female. Right? Or I have, a female part, so I identify with my body, or I'm thick, right? We identify, we make this the same as who we are. We think this is who we are. Why is this important for vision class to know this concept? Because the purpose of vision class is for you to know your life's purpose. You cannot know your life's purpose if you don't understand who you really are, and who you really are is not this ego. But we believe that it is us, right? We don't think that it is actually an ego. We don't call it an ego per se, but we think of ourselves in terms of the way that the ego would define us, right? So in that way, we are of the ego. So, okay, the ego has this thing and it's called wanting, right? And you cannot want without having, right? Because you need to want something that you can have. And we just talked about this principle of the idea that the ego has this ownership, right? It thinks that this couch is mine, right? If someone came in here and stole this couch, wouldn't I get mad and say, hey, excuse me, you just stole my couch, right? But is it really my couch? No. Does it become the thief's couch? No, does not become the thief's couch. It's just the couch. It's the couch. It's not my couch or his couch. It's the couch. So you guys are wondering, where does the ego, the thought forms in the ego, come from? The ego was developed several thousand years ago. There's no pinpointed time specifically, but several thousand years ago, when after people were enlightened. There was a time when people were truly enlightened, where people coexisted with the earth in peace and harmony. But of course, at one certain point, the thought overtook the reality of being, right? This emerged for a multitude of reasons that we don't need to go into today, or perhaps even in vision class. But what started to happen several thousand years ago is the dissociation of the self, right? And we're thinking of the concept of I am by myself. I being by myself implies two individuals there, and there are the ego and then the real you. So when you say I am by myself, technically you're saying my ego is with my being, which is true. There's the duality, right? The physical and spiritual realms. So when you speak of the ego and you think of this concept of duality and thought as creating our reality, right? We're mostly in our thoughts. We really don't live in our physical world even as much as we live in our own thoughts, right? If you continue to understand the ego as being comprised of these thought forms, then you start to understand why the ego has to survive through those thoughts, which is why it has a structure that must be filled with content. The content is what you want to have. Wanting does not exist without having. So you cannot just want something. Okay, you must want to have it. And that is the content that you now fill yourself with. So now that you've created your identity, who you are, this identity has to maintain itself through these things, right? If I create the identity that I'm famous, well, then I had better have things to show for it. I had better have a Porsche. I had better have an expensive home to debut on Cribs, right? I had better have some sort of a paparazzi following me. These are things that I want to have if I am of my ego and if I am seeking to maintain my ego subconsciously, right? So the ego wants more than it can have, because there was, really interestingly enough, Shakti Gawain, and I saw Tay Queen post this on her Facebook earlier, but Shakti Gawain speaks about this idea that, and so does Julia Cameron, by the way, but all of these authors speak about the fact that people don't believe there's enough to go around. That's part of the ego. This idea that there's not enough. The ego does not understand. You see, the ego has to separate itself constantly. It's a dissociation process. It's not a unification, it's a dissociation. So when the ego decides that you need to want something, the ego has to decide that you're the only one who can have that thing, because it creates a space of otherness. This person is other. This person is not of me, right? People who are fighting in other countries, it's always about my side versus their side. This is called the collective ego. So the ego does not just operate individually. It operates collectively as well. And the collective ego is far more dangerous than the individual ego, because the collective ego strengthens itself with other egos, right? And they can remain unconscious together, right? Hey, there's another side and we're all together in this, but we're all tricking each other subconsciously into believing we're all connected, because we're only connected for that common cause. As soon as that cause is done, then now we're fighting each other. And this is how it will always be with the ego, because people are always trying to attack the problem and not the root cause. The root cause is the ego. Right? And we're not to say that the ego is a problem, because earlier we talked about the path and what is your right path and what is your wrong path. Well, there is no such thing. There's only a path that you go down, and it will lead you to ultimately your purpose. That's it. Hopefully, if you get there. But to make the ego even your enemy is still more ego. Because the ego doesn't even know that it does that. The ego is that clever. Trust me, the structure is real. The structure is set in place so that the ego doesn't go anywhere. And when you're talking about a collective versus an individual ego, you're speaking about the same ego. The only difference is there's power in numbers, right? So, for example, if somebody makes fun of you because you have on a red and yellow dress, and then everybody else wants to gang up on you, right? Everyone together, that's their collective ego, not recognizing the oneness that you all share, and also not recognizing that if, for example, I am the one, let's say I fight back, right? Let's say I get upset back. The ego of the collective does not even understand that the ego within me is reacting to their ego. You understand? So that's how we continue fighting. And so what the ego does is it has name calling, right? These different layers that Eckhart Tolle speaks about. So you have name calling as the first level, right? Bitch, right? Second level of ego is, shouting. Now I'm going to call you bitch, and now I'm going to yell at you. Okay, I'm going to physically raise my voice. And the last, of course, resort of the ego will be physical violence. And this is what we see in the collective. People kill, right? They dehumanize people because they're other. They're not me, so I can kill you. It's okay, right? I can fight you. You're not me. Well, this bitch stole my man. Let me fight her, right? And so you go fight her because she's other. But what the ego doesn't recognize is that every time it destroys another individual, period, it's cutting itself off from the whole. So it's cutting its nose off to spite its face. But the ego is so clever that it will convince you that that is not what is going on, that there really is another other person, right? That it's them against you or you against them. The ego does not understand, all right, does not recognize that you are just the same as them. You have to recognize yourself in another. And by recognizing yourself in another, you are whole. And actually, the ego would dissolve if you worked together in peace, in harmony with someone. But nonetheless, you would actually prosper more by working in a group. That's why vision class is so important. We're not going to prosper on our own, keeping this knowledge to ourselves. No, we're talking about reading. We're sharing knowledge. That's why these books have been somehow through the universe made free through this class, because the knowledge is power. Okay, so the egoic identification is thus transient, right? It's ephemeral, short-lived, fleeting. The reason that the ego is transient is because it always wants things outside of itself, right? It always wants physical things. It's this concept of otherness. It's this concept of dissociation. It's this concept of duality. Now, there's nothing wrong with the concept of duality. We do live in a physical world. But what are we trying to do here? We're trying to be conscious of that duality. We are not trying to be of that duality. There's a difference. There's a difference between seeing it, checking it, and living in it than to become it, which is what the ego does. The ego seeks to make the same as, right? So to identify. So you are going to identify with the ego such that you think that it's actually you. And you will trick yourself out of morning pages. You will trick yourself out of artist date. Think about it. Your artist date is done with whom? It's done with yourself. We just talked about being by yourself, right? So the artist date is actually done with yourself. Yourself being your truest self. And this becomes deafening for people, right? They don't want to do this because they feel oh my God, I'm going to have to be alone. What does that mean? I've never done that. I don't think I can be alone, right? Because the ego strengthens itself in numbers and you feel more secure in numbers. That is exactly why you can't be alone. If you're alone, I said that the collective is more ignorant and more powerful than the individual. So think if you were alone, what would happen? The ego would expose itself. Doesn't want to do that, so it's going to trick you. These are so many reasons. These are so many reasons why you have to be able to peep what you're doing subconsciously to yourself. I said it earlier, Julia Cameron said that when you don't abandon others, you abandon yourself, all right? When you don't abandon that collective ego, you continue to stay in it by choice now, because you've now seen this lecture and you've read this book, which is now free and available to you on our website.
Llorando su anacaona
So I want you to really know the importance of the chapter role-playing. I think that everybody needs to make sure that they read this chapter in depth, read this chapter 100 times. Because this is what I've noticed. Part of the job of the ego is to create more ego. And the way that you do this is through the roles that you play, right? So something interesting and poignant that Eckhart Tolle speaks about is when you are dealing with two people who have egos, you now have the roles that they assume, the roles that they think the other person is based off of the role that they assume. And then you have that 2 times over. So whenever you're dealing with two people, right? Me and person A, right? I have my ego and therefore my role of that, because the ego is all about content, right? So a role is another part of content, right? It's another way for me to identify myself with something, right? Okay, my role is I'm mother, right? I'm the mom, right? So let's say I have me and my daughter then, fine. Good example. Me and my daughter. I have my ego, my role as the mother, and then I have her as my daughter because that's the role that she assumes based off of my role as mother, right? She's not just going to be sister because she's not my sister unless I have another child who she's the sister of, but that's not based off of my role. That would be based off of the other child's role. So basically based off of just my role as mother, the only association that she could have to me is daughter because that is who she is to me, right? So now I'm dealing with those two roles, those two egos. Now from her perspective, she is child and I am mother. Those are the two roles that she deals with. So between two people at any given time, you're dealing with 4 roles, 4 entities. Is that not crazy? But you are, right? Because the part of, like I said, the ego wants to strengthen itself through identification. And if it can identify with a role, then it becomes something, then it becomes important, right? It's this idea of self-importance. You see, one thing that Eckhart Tolle talks about that I'm like in love with, I'm in love with this, that's why I think that you should read this chapter, is he speaks about when the ego never is needed, right? When the ego stops being needed, I'll explain it in a second, then the ego has to still attach itself to something. It has to survive, right? So it's like Fallen, that movie with Denzel Washington. It just has to attach itself to a new host. So if it can no longer associate itself to a role, it'll create a new role for you to become so that you can have an identity because you think that you need it. So for example, once my daughter is no longer a child, she is no longer to be called my child. Again, we're talking about choosing our words consciously. She's not going to be my child anymore when she turns 18 because she's not a child. And regardless of how I perceive her, she's not a child, nor is she mine. So for me to call her my child would be erroneous. So what would I do? Bites nails. Nobody ever knows what to do with that answer, right? No one ever knows what to do with that question, rather. People always think, well, I'll just go on calling her my child because that's who she's always been to me. But wrong. You see, the ego is only doing that because it is fearfully trying to hold on to something. So it needs to identify with what it's always done. Now, what if the child grows up, becomes an adult, has their own family, they're no longer your child. I mean, they're 40, 50 years old. Does the 80-year-old say, my child is coming, and the 40-year-old walks in? No, they'll say, my daughter is coming. At least they've somehow disconnected from the role of, I am your parent. But you actually no longer become a parent once your child becomes an adult, which is another role, by the way, right? This is how adults act. This is how kids act. It's a role, right? It's something you play. It's not who you are. But the ego thinks that it is, right? I'm the mother of these kids, right? Somebody as a mom will say, I'm a mom. That's my role, right? Now, again, when two individuals are adults, then they just become adults. Granted, this kid came out of your womb, but for all intents and purposes, if you really break it on down, they're no longer your kid. They're just not. They are your offspring. They will always be your offspring. There's no mistake in that. But look at the words that we choose so that we can continue to perpetuate the ego. I mean, really think about this. No one ever thinks about this. But to this day, I'm 31. My parents are calling me my child. They'll say, my child's coming. I'm not a child. Like, I'm not. But what happens to me when I continuously hear that I am their child? I am their child. I identify with it. So much so that I have dated men who are children. Let's just be real. Let's just be real right now. Understand what I'm saying here? So picking your words consciously is quite important so that you don't trick yourself in identifying with them. Okay, so I want to talk to you really quickly about the paradox about suffering, because Eckhart Tolle talks about this paradox. People think that suffering is bad and, we don't understand it. I was, as you all know, I was assaulted this last week, and that is the reason that this class is late. And I was assaulted this last week. And while people felt bad for me, which I truly appreciate and gave me well wishes, there were people also coming out of the woodwork with reasons that the suffering should not have happened. And I recognized that immediately as ego. Immediately. Suffering is meant to be. But there's a difference between suffering, all right, suffering as having no purpose, and feeling pain. Pain will be there, right? People around you that you've attached yourself to are going to die. You are going to lose things that you are attached to, whether it be your hair, whether it be some people lose their limbs, whether it be your eyesight. You're going to lose things that you're attached to. It just is inevitable because everything visible is empty. And because, again, the ego is transient, it doesn't recognize this, so it's constantly attaching itself to things that end up going away. They have to go away because that is the nature of this physical environment. So what happens? So people think that suffering is yet something that we can eventually eliminate from our reality. People think that heaven on earth means we have no suffering. Heaven on earth just means ascension. And the only way that you can ascend is when you understand that suffering is purposeful. And I am using the word suffering, but perhaps that is not the word to use. And I do recognize that. Perhaps it is pain. But there comes a point in time where what you go through helps you. That is the paradox. You want to end suffering, but the only way to end suffering is through suffering. So suffering isn't necessarily bad. It's something that we need at this time. Perhaps in another realm or at another point in consciousness, we don't suffer. But right now on this earth, we do suffer. We do. Right? And for us to deny is to resist, is to close up, is to not recognize the ego, is to put up the ego's structure and perpetuate it further. So we have to begin to recognize that suffering is part of the plan. It's part of the plan. So when I was assaulted, and you see me now before you, back to myself better than ever, if not, if nothing else, you see me revitalized. And how is it so when just a few days ago I was going through it? Well, guess what? The ego cannot get me because I've put enough space between myself and the ego that I'm conscious of it. Whenever I feel pain, I know that's an indicator. As Julia Cameron said in week 3, whenever you see fear or anger, that is an indicator. Okay, that's pointing to something. So the ego is pointing me back to myself because I recognize it can't do anything to me. And what happens is the ego in another recognizes that and physically attacks me because that ego realizes that it cannot control me. And that was how deep that attack was. It genuinely was that deep. The ego in this person recognized, right, that there was no ego in me. And perhaps one of the manipulative ways that the ego was trying to get at me and to try to come back into me was through this individual, because perhaps I wasn't going to be peaceful and I was going to fight this individual back. Or perhaps I was going to cry or be sad for years like I used to do. But I've transcended that through this work. I believe, right? I can still go through the suffering. Let's not get it twisted. I will still go through suffering. But is it without purpose this time? It is not without purpose, and it's not without cognizance. And that is where we want to be, because that is the place of awareness, which is who we really are. last really big concept in A New Earth is the pain body. So again, we're talking about mechanisms. We're not talking about actual things. There is no such thing as a pain body or the ego. These are just words that, again, we're talking about words, and we were talking about spelling earlier in etymology. These are words that Eckhart Tolle utilizes to explain these concepts that are very deep, right? He has to create a word for it so that we don't have to consistently use our minds to think, what is this thing? What are you talking about? Okay, it's the ego. Great, it has a name. So now we want to talk about the pain body. And what is the pain body? The pain body, as opposed to the ego, is your emotional identification, right? So before we talked about content and structure of the ego as being thought forms, the pain body is now more closely related to emotion. So if you want to think of, one of the ways to understand even the Holy Trinity is often referred to as mind, body, and spirit, right? Three things: mind, body, spirit. Mind would be your ego, your body would be the pain body, and your spirit would be God, or would be unity or oneness, enlightenment, right? So, and also, if you guys, again, I always have worksheets that you can access for these, because these terminology are extremely difficult concepts to, these concepts are extremely difficult to grasp. So I did make worksheets up for you so that you can just reference them if you ever are wondering what I'm talking about, because it gets so nebulous in here. But the pain body is your emotional self, right? Your emotional attachment. The body's reaction to your mind. All right. So this is the greatest way of explaining it. When I talked about thought replacement in like week 1 or 2, I talked about the fact that you understand the emotion first, and then you ask yourself what thought generated that emotion. This is why. I didn't even realize that I was speaking about that until now. And he even talks about thought replacement in different words in A New Earth. So that is why I know this knowledge is not new. I know that is why this knowledge is coming from one consciousness, is coming from our Creator. Because when I tap into myself and try to understand it, it is simply a paraphrase of what another author has said. That is what tells you that is God consciousness, and that is not of the physical realm, because we all tap into that. So what is thought replacement? Thought replacement, again, is taking an emotion that you feel, a negative emotion, drawing attention to it, asking yourself where in your body it's emanating from, then asking yourself the thought that created that feeling. And by then, again, you create separated, you continue to create a space between yourself and the moment, so that you can become the moment and not the ego, right? So you continuously draw your attention to these emotions, to these thoughts. And one of the emotions that you would draw yourself to is this concept of the pain body, right? It's not really a specific emotion. The pain body essentially is the fact that your emotions, the emotions inside of your body, attach themselves to your thought. The pain body is part of the structure that feeds the ego. So initially, when you have an emotion, it is derived from thought, right? So a thought creates the emotion, right? So after the thought creates the emotion, and I wish I had diagrams, and I'm trying to get this software, but anyways, the thought creates the emotion. The emotion then feeds the thought, and it perpetuates itself, right? So the ego, which is the thought, gives this thought that we identify something with to the pain body, right? To our emotions. And then we feel bad inside. But because we feel bad, we have to have a need to go satiate ourselves. So what do we go get? Some content, right? From the ego. We go get content from the ego. What are you talking about? When I have a thought that my friends are driving Mercedes and I'm not, that thought can lead to a depression, because I'm now not enough. I don't have the status of my friends. That's my pain body reacting to my thought that was given to me from the ego. Then the pain body has to go satiate itself because it doesn't feel good. So it goes and gets content. It goes and gets a Mercedes to feel better. But alas, that doesn't satiate you either, because in the end, now these friends, they got Cadillacs. Well, I want a Cadillac. And it continues to cycle and cycle and cycle and cycle. So the pain body now reinforces the structure of the ego. Because if it were just ego, maybe you could dispel it. But now you've got emotions. Now you've got a second layer. How did this come to be? Eckhart Tolle talks about primordial fear, right? So in a primitive world, we may not have had these in the primordial, in primitive times, we may not have had the thought patterns that we have now that are complex. We may not have also had access to the internet or to cyberspace such that, again, our thoughts can even get more entrenched. We didn't have as much access to information. So whenever we experienced emotion, it was just fight or flight, because we didn't have the thought attached to it, right? So if there's no thought attached to your emotion, think about it this way. If somebody beats you, right? If someone beats you up, I know I'm talking about getting beat up here, but if somebody beats you up and they don't call you a name, or if they don't give you verbal abuse with the attack, then it's just an attack that makes no sense, right? Why did you hit me? But you're not going to feel emotional pain. Now take that same attack from your parent. Now you have emotional pain. Why? Because you have the structure, the thought, right? The thought that this person is your mother, the role, right? The ego is behind that. So now that you have the attachment to the source of the attack, now you have an emotion that goes along with that thought. And it's only because there's a thought. Excuse me. Now you have emotion that goes along with that attack simply because you have a thought, right? An idea of who this person is to me. But if there was not your mom hitting you, if it was a random stranger hitting you, they would be a stranger. So perhaps you'd hit back, but it would be a fight or flight, right? A fight or flight being a response. You would just respond, but you wouldn't have to think about it, and it wouldn't be something emotional. So this is how emotion started to arise. When thought arose through the ego, now the primitive emotion of fight or flight can become the pain body. And that is what we're talking about.
Today, we discussed recovering a sense of possibility by understanding the limitations we place on the Creator's ability to manifest our visions. We also learned how having divine experience during morning pages connects us to our awareness of our being. Finally, we discussed a new earth to better understand the mechanisms behind the ego and pain body, which serve to detach us from our awareness and thus from our true selves. Join us next Friday, July 12th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as we learn how to activate our visions with gratitude and abundance. We will also speak to our resident field expert, Tay Queen, as she discusses the topics of time and etymology. Our discussion will cover A New Earth. Make sure to read The Artist's Way Week 6, as well as finish A New Earth or The Isaiah Effect. We will follow our discussion with a midterm on Sunday, July 21st from 9:30 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at our Ustream address listed in the description box below.
Thank you so much for watching. I know this video was extremely long in comparison to the others, but it was, first of all, a makeup week. Second of all, this is a big concept. And if I don't break it all the way down, it's already broken down enough and it's still confusing. But if I don't break it all the way down, it'll be, you may give up and be futile at this point. But the hope of doing A New Earth and the hope of doing the Isaiah Effect is to give you the concept to help you see on a deeper level why we do what we do, and to reassert all the more reason for us to really do these morning pages and artist date, because the morning pages and the artist date will automatically start dissolving that ego. But now you know what it is. So as you're doing the artist date and as you're doing the morning pages and the ego is becoming dissolved, you know what it is and you can feel triumphant because you now know what is going on inside of you. You know the mechanism. All right. See you next week. Peace and peace.